Here we go, Digi Bio Workbook 8, Ecology. So look, some of you are famous. What do we call all the people who interact within Churchill each day? That includes students, teachers, staff, administrators, families, guests, etc. Just like you when you were building that shelter thing at the beach in Washington, that is a community. A community is two or more populations of different species sharing the same space and interacting. And in this picture, we have a community that includes the elephant, these gazelles or impala or antelope, whatever those are, zebra, the trees and plants and shrubs and maybe some grasses are part of the community. And when you have different communities interacting also with the non-living things in their environment, you have an ecosystem. So groups of organisms in a specific area and the non-living things. So here, this is an ecosystem with the fish and the plants and the boy are all alive. The rocks and the water and the air are not alive, but they're all interacting. We talked about this little globe during class, but this is a sealed, sustainable ecosystem. If we zoom in, you'll see there are little tiny shrimp-like things swimming around, and there's something green. So the green thing, maybe some algae, maybe some seaweed type of thing, can photosynthesize just with light. Then there's some air trapped inside the bubble with the water as well, so the plant has everything it needs for photosynthesis. The algae that grows on the branch and the plant itself can be eaten by the shrimp. The shrimp produce carbon dioxide, which the plant uses, and the whole thing is a self-sustaining ecosystem, and you never actually have to open up the ball to feed the shrimp because it has everything it could possibly need in this little tiny area. Now, a few things could go wrong. If the shrimp aren't reproducing properly, over time they won't continue to survive, or if waste builds up for whatever reason and the algae is not able to process out the waste, something like that, that could also affect everything in this little bubble surviving. But for the most part, this is a totally self-sustainable environment and ecosystem, and it's a complete unit, so it can go on forever. Next, we have biomes. So biomes are a large region where organisms have evolved similar techniques to adapt to a certain type of conditions. And the two most important things, the two main factors that determine which organisms can be successful in a biome are temperature and water. So here, if we're looking at this pyramid that we filled in together during class, this side is for temperature. Down here is the hottest environment, and then as it decreases, up here is the coldest environment. Over on the left is the wettest environment, and then as the moisture decreases, we have the driest environment. So the hottest, wettest climate is a rainforest. The hottest, driest would be a tropical desert, and a savanna is in the middle. Then this is where humans tend to live most, in the subarctic and temperate climates. We have a temperate forest, which is just like if you went back in time to New York City before buildings and roads were here. You would see trees and grasses. Like if you go out to the suburbs or Connecticut, New Jersey, Long Island, you'll see that there's lots of wooded area and forests. That is what our natural habitat here in New York looks like. As you go west across the United States, you move into grasslands. They're typically pretty flat. There might be things like prairie dogs living on them, maybe some bison. And then as you move southwest in the U.S., you get to temperate desert. So it's dry and sandy. There's some cacti, but it's pretty cold at night. Then as you go north in our northern hemisphere, you get to something called a taiga, also called a boreal forest. And that is pine trees, evergreens, mountains, snow, kind of like where we went to Olympic National Park together. And then up top, the coldest and the level of moisture doesn't tend to change much is called a tundra, and it's Arctic. There's something called permafrost in a tundra, meaning the ground is permanently frozen, at least a little bit, and not that many things can live up there. Things like bears and wolves can survive. Those are mostly in the taiga anyway, but the tundra, you have to be pretty furry and well adapted, maybe some penguins, things like that. So we talked about why temperature and water are the most important factors for the living things that can live in the environment, and we talked about how the adaptations that you might need to live in a desert are going to be different than the adaptations you need to live in a subarctic area. So the water levels and the temperature control what organisms and what adaptations are present. So in a rainforest, you might have plants that are really good at losing their moisture throughout the day, whereas in a desert, they retain their moisture for a long period of time. Or in a tundra, you might have something with thick fur or a lot of blubber, like a whale. And in a savanna, those organisms need to be pretty good at cooling themselves off. There are about 7 to 9 major biomes on Earth. The fancy word for what a biome looks like is called the physiognomy. And we agreed that there was a major motion picture, usually Disney, Pixar, maybe DreamWorks, for almost every biome. So in the tropical rainforest, we said Tarzan or the Jungle Book. In a temperate forest, almost all the fairy tales take place in temperate forests because that's what Northern Europe, where the fairy tales were written, looks like. But we said Bambi was a temperate forest. In one of the classes, we said The Fox and the Hound. The boreal forest would be anything with wolves and pine trees, and you guys agreed Frozen might take place in a boreal forest. For the desert, we said Aladdin, maybe certain scenes of Cars also takes place in Arizona. That could be a desert. Lion King is obviously the savanna. Grassland we had a little more trouble thinking of, but something like Home on the Range, farm movies, Charlotte's Web, that could all happen to be grassland. For marine, we said Finding Nemo, Finding Dory, and The Little Mermaid. For freshwater, we agreed that a swamp was freshwater, so that would be Shrek, or The Princess and the Frog, that takes place near a lake. And then for a tundra, also could be Frozen, haha, because tundras are always frozen, or Happy Feet if we're talking about Antarctica or penguins. Food chains. So a food chain is a model of how energy flows between living things in an ecosystem. It's what eats what. But I find the arrows a little bit confusing because this makes it look like the leaf eats the caterpillar that ate the chameleon, but we know that leaves cannot eat caterpillars. So we have to think of the arrows as the leaf provides energy for the caterpillar, that provides energy to the chameleon, and so on. So we're going to add that in a text box below. So the arrows show the energy provided by one organism to the next. We also talked about heterotrophs. We remembered that heterotrophs are the opposite of an autotroph. An autotroph is a plant. Autotrophs make their own food, like the leaf or this plant in that picture. And heterotrophs need to eat not only one food, but a variety of foods for the most part. So you might be a caterpillar that only eats plants, but you might not just eat exactly one type of leaf. Or if you're a chameleon, you might eat caterpillars, but you might also eat crickets or worms or something like that. So no, heterotrophs do not just eat one food. No, they eat a variety. And what would be a more realistic depiction? This would be called a food web, maybe a network, or some of you also said cycles. Those would all be good answers. If you need to pause to write these things down, let me put them in a different color so you can see where our answers are. And then we'll look at a food web in more detail. There you go. So pause here if you need to write those answers down. If you're ready, in class we talked about how a food web is a group of food chains interacting. This is a little bit more realistic than just owls can only eat weasels, for example. So the sun provides the energy for the plant. Remember, we can start with the plant or the sun to figure out what these arrows mean, because off the top of my head, I don't know if a weasel eats a shrew or if a shrew eats a weasel. So I like to start at the beginning with the sun. So the sun provides energy for the plant. The plant gets eaten by the grasshopper. The grasshopper can get eaten by a spider, a shrew, a weasel, or a hawk. Not a great time to be a grasshopper. The spider can get eaten by the shrew or the hawk or the weasel, and the spider eats the grasshopper. The shrew can get eaten by a weasel or a hawk or an owl, and it eats spiders or grasshoppers. The weasel can eat the shrew, it can eat the spider, or it can eat the grasshopper, and it can get eaten by an owl or a hawk. The hawk, look at all those arrows pointing to the hawk. So the hawk can eat the grasshopper, the spider, the shrew, or the weasel, but the hawk can only get eaten by the owl. And the owl can eat the hawk or the weasel or the shrew, but the owl does not have a predator in this food chain. So we also talked about in class how how can the owl population not be out of control if there's no predator? A few reasons. In a given ecosystem, there will be tons of plants and many, many grasshoppers and many spiders and even many shrews and weasels probably, but maybe only 2 or 3 owls are supported by that ecosystem. Or owls might be competitive with hawks, for example. So even though the owl can eat the hawk and the owl share a lot of food sources, so there might not be as many resources for that owl to live in that ecosystem. Lastly, owls could be competitive with each other, and that's how that number of owls in the given area would be limited by the other things. So we'll focus more on that next week. So now we can give all of these different parts of the food web labels that correspond with what they eat or where they are in the web. So the plants are producers. That means our autotrophs produce glucose. They're the first step. They use the energy from the sun to produce the sugar, the glucose, and then everything else has to rely on plants. Our primary consumers, primary means first, are herbivores. So in this picture, the only herbivore listed is the grasshopper. The grasshopper eats the plant. It is the primary consumer. Then we have secondary consumers. So those are carnivores that eat the herbivores. So in this picture, the spider eats the grasshopper. That makes the spider the secondary consumer. The shrew can also eat the grasshopper, and the weasel can eat the grasshopper. So since they're eating the primary consumer, that makes them the secondary consumers. Above the secondary, we have a fancy word for third. We have the tertiary consumers. So those are carnivores that eat other carnivores. So here, the hawk and the owl are listed as tertiary consumers because the hawk can eat the spider that ate the grasshopper. The hawk could also be a secondary consumer if it just directly eats the grasshopper. And it could even be a fourth consumer, which we'll look at in a moment. So the weasel is listed as a secondary consumer because it can eat the primary, the grasshopper. But a weasel could also be a tertiary if it eats the spider that ate the grasshopper, that ate the plant. We're going to add a new word to this that we added in class. That is a quaternary consumer. So that means fourth level. So if we look at this picture, the hawk can eat the shrew that ate the spider that ate the grasshopper. That makes the hawk the fourth level. Same with the owl. If the owl eats the hawk that ate the spider that ate the grasshopper, blah, 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 that's a fourth level. That's a good quaternary consumer. Sometimes we also call this the apex predator, the owl in this case, because it can eat everything and nothing can eat it. So it is the top of the line. Another term from today, we have omnivores. So humans are omnivores. We eat a little bit of each. Now, we don't tend to eat anything in this picture, but we eat plants, we eat animals. I would actually put humans here on the secondary consumer line, which we'll talk more about next week. But humans are omnivores and carnivores that eat herbivores and plants. We don't tend to eat any tertiary consumers. So as humans, we eat things like beef, which is cow, pork, which is pig, chicken, which is chicken, and fish. So we tend to eat animals that are herbivores. So a cow eats grasses, chickens eat grains, and fish can eat other fish, but they also eat things like algae or seaweed, aquatic plants. So we tend not to eat other carnivores. The only exception to this would be when we eat pork. Pigs will eat anything you put in front of them, but the pigs that we raise for food, we don't tend to feed them meat. We'll talk more about that next week, but we would find humans somewhere here with secondary consumers. We're also omnivores. Lastly, we have the decomposers. Those are things like bacteria and fungi that feed on any dead thing they can find, so decomposing matter, and they return the minerals to the food chain. Another concept we talked about briefly today, we haven't written it on this slide because we'll talk more about it next week, are the scavengers. So a scavenger will eat anything already dead. So in the cartoons, you see a lot of vultures that come down for Bugs Bunny as he's getting dehydrated. A scavenger eats things that are already dead. That's different from a carnivore, like a secondary or tertiary consumer, because carnivores eat things that are freshly dead, so they kill their food, or like humans, we preserve our food, so they kill the cow for beef, and then that stays in the refrigerator until we're ready to cook it and eat it. We don't just find a dead cow and eat it because of the pathogens. So scavengers have slightly different body systems that allow them to eat food that's previously dead without making them sick. Next, we did a recap of all of the different levels of living things interacting. So we started with one elk in this picture is an individual. The next ring, we have a bunch of different elk living together. That's a population. So that can be a little confusing. When we say a population, we're referring to all the same species in a given area. Then, in this third ring, you can see we have different animals, we have more plants, so all the different populations interacting are community. As we go out to this ring, you'll see in this community we have added water, a river of some sort, and a mountain range. So the community with the non-living things introduced is an ecosystem. Many different ecosystems interacting together make up a biome. And then all the biomes on Earth, so all of the tundras and the taigas and the temperate forests and so on, those make up the biosphere, which is all the living surface area of the Earth. Next, we have biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are all the living things an organism interacts with in its environment or ecosystem, and abiotic factors are all of the non-living things. So this is a little bit tricky because something that gets produced by a living thing, even if that thing is not alive, is still considered biotic. So, for example, a dead animal was once alive. It's no longer alive now, but it was once alive, so that is still considered biotic. Or something like an eggshell. An eggshell itself is not alive, but it was produced by a living thing. It goes in the biotic category. Same thing with dairy products. The milk in your fridge is not alive itself, but it was produced by a cow or a goat or a sheep or something like that. And so that is considered biotic. So biotic would include animals, living and dead, plants and dead plant matter like sticks and twigs and stuff that are no longer on the tree. Bacteria, don't forget those are alive. Fungi, also living. And then I'll loop back for a few more examples. Abiotic, remember our definition of a mineral. A mineral is a non-living thing and was not produced by a living thing. Water is also abiotic. It was not alive. Sunlight, very important for living things, but sunlight itself is not alive. And air, again, cycled through living things, but not alive. Soil is our last one, and I'm actually going to put it in the middle because if you remember back to Earth Science last year, soil is often made out of dead parts of things that were once alive. Soil is often made out of dead parts of things that were once alive, like either fecal matter or sticks and twigs or old leaves, things like that. But depending on where you are, soil could also be made out of very small grains of the rock in the area. So if the soil happens to be from something like granite or sandstone, it is abiotic because its materials were not alive. So I'm going to put soil in the middle. The textbook puts it abiotic, but if we're thinking about soil that is made out of previously living things, that would make it biotic. So I'm going to just leave it in the middle there because it could go either way depending on what the soil is made out of. Okay, so we are going to pause here. I know you have more slides in this Digi workbook, but we will circle back to those later this week. See you later. Bye.